Welcome to Nasdaq Trade Talks. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq. Joining me is Christy Wyatt, CEO of Absolute, to discuss cybersecurity measures to protect companies critical to COVID-19 vaccination distribution, as well as preparing the government for the presidential transfer of power. Christy, it's great to have you with us. Welcome to Trade Talks.
Thanks so much for having us.
With new and rapid vaccine distribution, what's the risk of sharing patient data across organizations and hospitals?
I'd start by saying transparency and information sharing is actually critical to what we're doing. I think that we would not be in the position we're in with our response to the pandemic if there was not great information sharing happening across the various different pharmaceutical companies and across the industry and the medical providers. That said, we're also doing this work at a time when people are working remotely, they're going out to vaccination sites, they're working in a variety of different medical environments. And so the risk is high. The risk is high because all of that data about the patients, about the information, it's out in a whole variety of different locations. It's not all sort of contained within a building. It's required to be there. And so while the data about what we're doing needs to be shared, the patient information needs to be protected. And the risk is high. That means we need to up our game in terms of how we're thinking about those devices.
What about the security of the control systems used for tracking and distribution?
Even more critical. And again, we're back to those devices are sometimes centralized, sometimes distributed, probably more distributed than you would normally see them within these organizations right now. And especially given other events going on around us right now, you know, we're at an increased risk of not just what's happening within the pandemic, but just kind of what's going on in the world around us. We saw several large nation state attacks in the last 30 days even. And so we have to not just protect the integrity of the process, but we have to protect the information about, you know, where the vaccines are, who's next, how are they going to be released, how are they going to be protected. All of that is critical data from a security perspective as well as a healthcare perspective. And so we are vulnerable. And we're vulnerable in a very fast-paced world where we're making these processes and these distribution mechanisms very, very rapidly. And things that happen quickly, just by default, are going to be fragile.
So what's the solution to gain control over all this data? Where does Absolute fit into the ecosystem?
I guess the good news is that this is not different than what most IT organizations already know, which is you need to have a permanent digital connection to every device that you own. You need to know where it is. You need to know who has it. You need to know what data is on it. You need to know that you have the right security controls on that device, and you need to know that they're actually running. And while those are really simple things to say, they can be incredibly tricky things to do, especially when you have a mobile organization. That is what we do. We help people create that permanent digital connection to that device. But we also help make sure that those applications are actually running. So when we look at, you know, even recent security attacks that we've seen in the news, you know, a lot of what happened there was people sort of believing that certain controls were working when in some cases those controls were the things that had become compromised. And so endpoint hygiene is a really, really critical component, and that's what we can help a lot of customers with.
I also want to touch a little bit more on the cyber attacks the government experienced. What were the key challenges with something like the SolarWinds breach?
The key challenges, in addition to just the breadth, right? I mean, it was a very broad, very sophisticated attack, which you have to note. This was not simple, and it hit some of the smartest minds and best security minds in the industry. But they abused trust, right? They used the illusion of some brands and controls that customers trust, and used it as a way of accessing and infiltrating organizations, enterprise organizations, education organizations, and government organizations. And so we're back to that sort of endpoint control and resilience piece. There's two critical things there. The first is you've spent a lot of money on, most organizations have spent a lot of money on security capabilities. You need to know that the application you purchased is actually running on that device, and it's the right version, and it's actually yours. And so having that visibility of what's going on all of your devices, no matter where they are, just can't be overstated. And then the second thing is, how do you heal? Bad things are going to happen. We're dealing with very sophisticated adversaries. And so you need to be able to identify when the bad things are happening and very quickly get to the root of which devices are infected. Make sure that they are not just disconnected or password, but actually frozen from the BIOS, wiped, cleaned, remediated, whatever that remediation needs to look like. And so speed matters, right? How broadly and how deeply that infection goes really is dependent on your ability to respond.
And finally, we also have a contentious presidential transfer of power around the corner. What should the government's approach look like during this transition?
Whenever you have any transition, any leadership transition, political transition, we're probably in a more sensitive one than we would normally see. But there's going to be vulnerability. Things are changing, people are changing, the administration's changing, systems are moving. Even in the events of last week, we read that there were a number of critical laptops and devices stolen from within the Capitol building, all that were connected to sensitive information, took sensitive information with them. And so in those moments, you need to be thinking about control systems. It's not enough to just say, I'm going to, freeze. I have a device management package. I'm just going to freeze that device. You need a kill switch, right? When there's that much volatility, you need certainty. You need to know that exactly where that device is. And you may get it back, you may not, but you need essentially a kill switch that says that device and that data, more importantly, is unusable to anyone else who has their hands on that keyboard. I mean, again, that's something we can help customers with. I think that this multi-layered approach is critical, because while you're in an environment like the one that we find ourselves in, unfortunately, right now, there's a lot of talk right now broadly about physical risk, physical attacks, what's going to be happening in the next 10 days around the physical sort of the people and the systems and the platforms and the buildings. But you have to assume that there's a cyber approach happening at the same time. Again, we're in a modern world where when somebody wants to compromise you, they're going to think about both planes.
All right, Christy, appreciate the insight. Thanks for joining us on Trade Talks, and thanks for joining me. I'm Jill Malandrino, Global Markets Reporter at Nasdaq.